Well, after spending years down in the dumps after the 2009 Copenhagen debacle, the eco-alarmists are jumping up and down like silly sausages. Here in Australia, we've got the Fairfax papers, the headlines screaming that Australia is going to be left out in the cold because of Barack Obama's amazing new deal with China on climate, or supposed deal on climate that's going to slash emissions, supposedly. I think we better check into this and see if there's any reality, if there's any truth behind the spin. Actually, there's a lot of proof to show that the US-China climate deal that Obama's just agreed upon, there was nothing signed because it's non-binding, it's merely an intention to supposedly cut emissions. It's really a con. It's a charade, a joke, or whatever you want to call it. But it's pure nonsense. Let's go on and look into that. Now, we can ignore all the science. We can say, oh, although there's been no global warming for 18 years, well, we'll ignore that. We'll ignore it that the IPCC's been wrong on all its projections, all its models are wrong. You know, the real temperatures of the satellites and the surface temperature data sets have all fallen below the IPCC's supposedly 95% confidence levels. I wonder how confident they are now. But anyway, what was agreed was that China said they'll ensure that, or it's their intention to ensure that their emissions, their CO2 emissions, will stabilize by 2030. And after that, they'll start to reduce them. And in return, Obama said that what the US will do is he'll commit the US to reducing its emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. Which is both of these statements really by the Chinese president and the US president are business as usual. They're not changing anything, which I'll demonstrate. Okay, let's look at the coal consumption of the whole world here. Now, this is in millions of metric tons of oil equivalent. It comes from the World Energy Review of the World Energy, BP's Statistical Review of World Energy this year. And it shows here, as you can see, that up until 1980, there wasn't much difference between the emissions, or the coal consumption, I should say, of the EU, the US, and the Asia Pacific, of which, of course, China is a very large part. Now, since then, watch that blue line. Look how it's zooming up there. Now, the majority of the reason for that zooming up is China's coal consumption. And we'll expand on this a little bit in a minute, but firstly I just want to look at the total energy consumption of China. This of course includes things like petrol for vehicles and so on. That's their total energy consumption. Now coal is about 70% of that, oil 18%, as you see. Hydroelectric is quite big in China, 6%, which is of course emission free. Natural gas 4%, which is half the emissions of coal or oil. Nuclear 1%, and the others, which are less than 1%, of things like wind and solar, which are pretty well irrelevant in China, contrary to what you'll hear from the alarmists. Now, this is in relation to power generation. Now, as you see across most regions in China, coal is a vast portion, at least 65% and up to 98% of electricity production. That's why in the north part there where Beijing is, that's why you get all that pollution. It's mainly because the power stations in China do not clean up their emissions. Their real pollution, which has been largely cleaned up in the power stations in the West, which China has not got around to that yet. Okay, we'll now look at the carbon dioxide emissions of China. Starting from 1970, and you can see that there were about 1 billion tons compared to around about 5 billion tons for the US. So the US was 5 times greater. And this gap here is what the alarmists are calling the historical gap of emissions. So they're more or less blaming the US for the CO2 rise that's in the atmosphere. Now, that has largely disappeared now because of China's massive, enormous, skyrocketing emissions, which is unprecedented in history, which I will come to in a second. Now, as you can see, China had a pretty good rise up until 2000, but after 2000, things really got moving, and it's gone right off the chart now. China's carbon dioxide emissions are now over 10 billion tons per year, more than twice as much as the next highest emitting country, which is the USA. Now, what about the future? Now, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has said that his intention, in quotes, is to stabilize China's emissions by 2030, which of course is 15, 16 years away. And the prediction by many people is that, such as the Energy Information Administration's here, the International Energy Outlook, but there's many other sources you can look at for this. They predict that China will roughly double from 2014 levels, that is present levels, will roughly double its emissions by 2030. Some people say it will be triple, others say it will be double, but anyway, it's going to be way, way in excess of anything that they're emitting now. That's for certain. Now, if we look at China, and the main reason for this is China's skyrocketing coal power consumption. Of course, China's pretty well self-sufficient in coal. They do buy a bit of specialist coal from Australia and a couple of other places, metallurgic coal and so on for steel production, but for power production, they have their own, they have huge resources of their own thermal coal. Now, as you can see from this is data from Climate Central website. In the 4 years 2005 to 9, China added the equivalent of the entire US coal consumption to its consumption. Then 2010 to 13, it added half of it again. And right now, China burns more than 4 billion tons of coal a year. The US burns less than 1 billion, the EU about 0.6 billion. In fact, at the moment, China consumes more coal than all the rest of the planet combined. Just think about that for a moment. And by 2030, it will double the massive coal consumption it's already got. So that's the agreement that Obama's made with China. Is that a joke? No, it's really happening. This is the agreement Obama made. We're starting here at 1990. As you can see, the US emissions are about 5 billion tons of CO2, China about 2.5, 3 billion. A gradual rise until 2005, when China's emission passed the US emissions. At that time, US emissions peaked and are now falling dramatically, not because of Obama, but in spite of Obama. The US emissions would have dropped a lot more if it wasn't for Obama sticking his nose into the fracking business. Right, so the main reason US emissions are falling partly because of the recession they had, but mainly because of fracking. That is the change of power production from coal to gas. Gas has just over half the CO2 emissions of coal. Now here we can see the projected emission scenario of the future, and it has now become, with Barack Obama and Xi Jinping's agreement at APEC this week, it's become an agreed emission scenario. That China will be allowed to continue on its present path with its CO2 emissions bounding along enormously until it gets to about 22 billion. It's presently about 10, 11 billion, about 10.5 billion tons a year. And it will bound along to about 22 billion by 2030. And then it's supposedly going to stabilize its emissions. I wouldn't be holding my breath, but that's what it's supposedly their intention is. Now, at the same time, Obama has agreed to slash US emissions by 26 to 28% on 2005 levels, which of course was the peak of emissions for the USA, by 2025. Now, Obama is already, I should say the US is already on this path. So US emissions are already going in this direction, no matter what Obama does or doesn't do. So Obama's interim target is 17% cut on 2005 emissions by 2020. The US emissions are below that target line and have been for quite some years. In fact, it looks like the 25-26% could be reached by 2020 or 2022. So even if Obama does nothing other than allow fracking, he doesn't need to worry about anything else. You can forget about windmills and solar power. They won't do anything, make any difference anyway. And same in China. You know, wind and solar power are not going to make any difference to anything in China or the US. The only thing that China is going to do is what it was going to do anyway by 2030, which is keep on using enormous amounts of coal and actually double coal production. Currently they're building one new coal-fired power plant every 10 days. They'll keep doing that until 2030. And at the same time, they'll increase nuclear power production, which they was planning on doing anyway, and have more hydro, which is, well, both of those are emission-free technologies. So nuclear and hydro, that's what China's going to do. That's what it's planning on doing anyway. So there's no change to China's plans. What Xi Jinping has agreed to is business as usual. That's all Obama's agreed to, business as usual. That's what the US is doing anyway. That's the way their emissions is tracking anyway. And this new agreement has done nothing. Zero. It's made no difference at all. So it's a giant con. But the alarmists are still jumping up and down. They think it's something fantastic when it's actually business as usual. He's got his war on coal. As he said, I will focus like a laser beam on jobs. And that's what he's doing. He's focusing like a laser beam on Americans' jobs. That is, to destroy those jobs. That's what he's trying to do. There's about 1 million people in the US that are dependent on coal for a living, directly and indirectly, probably more. But the worse than that is the price of energy. Of course, Obama's going to drive up the price of energy with his war on coal and forcing these emissions reductions when they don't come naturally by using gas. And these are the guys that Obama's going to put out of work, or they'll continue, so that they'll continue to vote for the Democrats, so that they'll continue to get their food stamps. And in a couple of years, Obama will be finished as president, and then he can say, my work is done here. I've smashed the US economy, kicked everyone out of work. The emissions are down to nothing, and I've cut America down to size.